Tell me. Good morning, everybody. It is Monday, August 29th, 2022, and it is my privilege to call to order the Policy and Innovation Committee of SACOG, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. And welcome, everyone, for this Monday morning. And with that, I would like to invite you to rise and join me in honoring our nation's flag. And of your heart, ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. That's always a great way to start our day. We will get started with a roll call, please.
All right, just before the roll call, a few housekeeping announcements. Good morning. This meeting is being recorded and streamed over the internet. For members of the public, we accept and encourage public comment and have provided options that are listed at the top of this meeting agenda. For committee members participating online, thank you for joining us today. Please mute your devices when you're not speaking and use the raise hand feature in Zoom should you wish to get a comment. All right, directors, when they call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Bernasconi?
Here.
Burris? Absent. Frerichs?
I am here.
Stollard?
Here.
I'm sorry, Director Stollard, can you repeat that? Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Vice Chair Middleton?
Here.
Oh, thank you. Vice Chair Middleton? Absent. Vice Chair Thomas?
Here.
And Chair Kozlowski? Absent. And we have a quorum.
All right, I believe Chair Kozlowski will be joining us shortly, but in the meantime, I am happy to lead us forward. At this point, on public communications, do we have any persons wishing to address this committee?
There's no public comment.
Right. Wonderful. We now move on to the consent calendar. We have two items before us this morning. Are there any committee members that wish to comment or remove an item from the consent calendar? Not seeing any. Does anyone wish to comment on the consent calendar? Any public comment? All right. With that, I'm ready for a motion.
Bernasconi, I move that we approve the consent calendar.
Do I have a second?
I'm happy to second. Frerichs?
Frerichs, second. Wonderful. Roll call vote, please.
Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi?
Yes.
Burris? Absent. Frerichs?
Yes.
Stollard?
Aye.
Vice Chair Middleton?
Aye.
Vice Chair Thomas?
Aye.
Chair Kozlowski? Absent. Motion carries.
Thank you very much. We now move on to the action items of the morning. I understand item number 3 has been tabled, Eric?
Yes, it has. Directors, just a brief update on this item. So as the item states, we did receive responses to our RFP, but we're still in the process of reviewing all the firms who submitted and hope to bring a full recommendation to the committee at its October meeting.
Okay, wonderful. Certainly appreciate everyone that has participated in that. I'm delighted that we had received such a robust response and look forward to that coming back to us in October. Thank you, Eric. With that, we move on to item 4, approve amendment to CalPERS contract. Eric.
Yes, I'll take this item as well. So last month I was before you with a resolution of intent to amend our contract with CalPERS. This is the actual amendment to the contract. So this action item today would have SACOG modify its contract with CalPERS to incorporate temporary employees who currently were not in the contract, which is required by CalPERS law. So this amendment is on action here. It will be on action at the board due to CalPERS regulations, but it has no anticipated cost to SACOG.
All right. Do any committee members have any questions on this item? Not seeing any. All right. Fairly routine item. Any public comment on this item?
There is no public comment.
All right.
Stollard will move the item.
Do I have a second?
Middleton, second.
Excellent, thank you. Roll call vote, please.
All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi.
Yes.
Burris. Absent. Frericks.
Yes.
Stollard.
Aye.
Vice Chair Middleton.
Aye.
Vice Chair Thomas.
Aye.
And Chair Kozlowski. Absent. Motion carries.
All right, wonderful. Well, we are moving rapidly through the items this morning. And with that, we are moving on to our information items. And Casey, you're up on the Working Draft Racial Equity Action Plan. Good morning, Casey. Oops. I think the boardroom is muted.
Sorry, one moment.
Not muted. I just needed to figure out my.
There we go.
All right. Good morning, Vice Chair Thomas. So this item is the Working Draft Racial Equity Action Plan. It had come to the Policy and Innovation Committee last month with just an update on what the Race Equity Inclusion Working Group had done with regard to the development of this plan. But what we'd like to do today, and we're doing this with all of the board committees this week, is to walk through the goals and objectives in this Working Draft Racial Equity Action Plan so that you can provide your feedback as well. And also give us, we're particularly interested in what you might want to prioritize, what you are excited about, what you see as potentially challenging or controversial, because with all of that input, we want to use that to develop the final draft Racial Equity Action Plan. That Racial Equity Action Plan will be finalized in this month of September, brought forward to the Race Equity Inclusion Working Group at the end of September, at their September 30th meeting. We hope for their finalizing of that and their recommendation to forward it back to the Policy and Innovation Committee to recommend to the full board for adoption in October. That is a very short summary of the process. And what I would like to do now is to walk through each of the goals and objectives, again, with the hope that you can provide for us feedback, which again, what you are excited about, what you see as potentially controversial or challenging, and what you would want to prioritize. I also, before I go into that, I should note that this is very, very much a working draft, which means you will see, if you have reviewed the document, you will see that not all of the actions are spelled out. There are timelines that have not been yet delineated, and there are measures and indicators that are TBD, because we really wanted to focus on first getting the goals and the program, the goals and the objectives nailed down, and then everything will flow from that. So your feedback really will help us to flesh out the rest of this. So with that, I'd like to ask Robert if you can put up some goals and objectives on screen. While he's doing that, a little bit more background here. All of the goals and objectives within this working draft plan are as truly as we could do this, taking all of the learnings that we got from our listening sessions with stakeholders and with the one-on-one interviews with the REI working group members. We took as much as we could, translated that directly into goals and objectives. The goals and objectives cover 3 focus areas for SACOG. The first of those is operations. The second of that is all of our programs. So we have like an internal and an external focus. And then the third focus area is board practice. With that overview, I would like to start in on operations. And what we'll do, I'm also stalling for Robert.
One moment, sorry.
No problem. What we'll do is Eric is going to walk through operations and I'll walk through programs. James will walk through board practices. And what we want to show you is tie for you how that goal and that objective was created out of the learnings we had from those listening sessions. Let's see. Oh, here we go.
Great.
And we'll start with Eric.
All right, thanks. And good morning again, board members. So in the operations area and all 3 areas, we've established 3 goals. And so I want to break down kind of where our focus areas are in operations. The first 2 have to do with our people. And the third one has to do with our procurement. So our first goal on the next slide is about the people that we have today and really thinking about, are there things that we can do to audit our processes, and connect with our staff to make sure that everyone feels safe and included in the workplace, as well as thinking ahead to what are the things that we can do to continuously improve. And this includes things like looking at our agency demographics all the way through the life cycle of an employee, from the time people are applying or interested in working at SACOG to when they leave. What are the demographic trends, are they divergent from the rest of the region, or are there places where they're perhaps more convergent? And then if we move on to the second goal, or the second goal on the next slide, this is looking more to what we can do to attract people. So again, we have a good sense of who our people are today and how we can help to develop them. This is really looking at how do we improve that overall experience. And this is about doing a better job of connecting. SACOG is not a household name in the region, and that's not where we're focused, but we do want to make sure people who are skilled know that there are opportunities here, and we start to talk with students. And YLA is one example of this, but also looking at college level internships. How do we make people understand that there's a career for them at SACOG? This also goes into things related to our training. So how can we ensure that all of our staff aren't just focused on the diversity, but also the inclusion piece of when we bring people into the organization, how do they feel welcomed? How do we understand working with different groups of people and also kind of serving the common goal of bettering our region? And then if we go on to the third goal here, this switches over to the procurement side of things. And so, with all these, acknowledging that there are constraints, working in California and in the federal context of, what we can do to specifically target achieving racial equity. But we think all these things help us further those goals. And so here, again, taking a step back and kind of auditing who do we work with and what's the process by which we go through procuring those contracts, whether they're small or large, again, ensuring that the whole business community in our region and outside of our region understands that the type of work that SACOG needs assistance with, and that we're attracting a diversity of businesses to bid on our work and try to work with us. So that's in short, kind of an overview of where we're focused on the operations goals. And maybe with that, stop and see if there's any questions or comments from any of the board members.
Sir, any board member questions at this point? I am not seeing any, Robert.
I'm not seeing any questions either.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. And we'll pause after each section, and then at the end as well. Again, questions, feedback, anything that again is of interest to you, that you think would be challenging or controversial, that you would prioritize. We are looking for all of that.
Actually, at this point, I do have a question then on the first internally. If you were to poll staff, and I'm sure you've had many robust and engaged conversations around this, how well is SACOG doing in this arena right now? What would our staff give what would our scorecard be right now as far as how we are creating an inclusive workspace currently?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't want to read too much into it, but I would say I think it's fair to characterize our staff as cautiously optimistic. We, as you may be aware, we do an annual employee engagement survey, and this year we introduced some questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think, both in the quantitative responses as well as some of the written comments, our staff were supportive of the efforts we're taking, eager to see what comes next, and kind of curious about what changes may occur from that. So I think in short, that's what I could say about kind of where our staff are on this. Okay,
great. So we're certainly on the right track, and looking forward to how we expand that work.
And I may add, if I may, across the three focus areas, there are objectives in there. They were probably not as clearly articulated as we will try to do in the final version, but objectives that relate to establishing some baselines so that over time we can actually measure our progress towards achieving objectives and goals.
Yeah, important to have measurable goals and know where we're starting from.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you
Great.
so much. All right. On to programs.
Programs, yes. And so 3 goals under programs as well. This first goal about engaging community representatives and all of the objectives within is really addressing probably the biggest theme we got out of the listening sessions, which is SACOG, you're a government agency. All government agencies, including you, need to do a much better job of listening to the community that you serve and understanding them and incorporating that into your work. And so our first program objective here, 1A, is recognizing that SACOG is not a direct service provider. We are not, we are not the cities and counties. We are the collection of cities and counties. And so this is about strengthening partnerships with community representatives, leaders, community-based organizations, so that we can, over time, maintain regular communication with them and really try to work at that, that level of community to then be able to do whatever outreach we may need to do over time. Because even as a government agency, we are still needing and required to do public engagement in the work we do. The second objective here is calls out the 2024 blueprint specifically to create an outreach and engagement plan that includes specific strategies to engage communities of color and underrepresented communities, because the blueprint plan that we do, it essentially sets for several years the work program that SACOG does. And so since we are just starting in on the blueprint update, we wanted to call that out specifically on the ground floor of that update so that we can try to build equitable engagement directly in. And then the third objective is an attempt to really try to strengthen our engagement with tribal governments. We are required to do this already every 4 years for the update of the blueprint. That has had varied success over time, and it has certainly, we would admit, been much more transactional in nature. And what we are trying to do in light of our goal is to try to establish, try to engage so that there is hopefully at some point a continuing and building relationship with those tribal governments. Second goal, please, here we go. To increase funding for programs and projects that prioritize race, equity, inclusion, and or specifically engage underrepresented and underserved communities in the SACOG region. So again, this is going straight back to the learnings that we received, and we really need to try to focus on these communities. And so that's what you will see in all of these different objectives. We have an objective to, through the blueprint plan update, formalize a long-term commitment to the Engage, Empower, Implement program. That is the funding program that the SACOG board established in the 2020 funding round. We are about to launch that. And so it's this goal to have that continue longer term. The next objective really crosses with some of the operations goals of investing in a leadership and talent pipeline program. We call out the Youth Leadership Academy here specifically, but also really working with professional organizations in the region as well. And then finally, the last objective here is probably about establishing a baseline for this goal the most, which is to evaluate our major programs and planning work to identify opportunities to increase racial equity and reduce disparities. So we won't really know if we're having an impact if we can't measure what it is that we are trying to assess. And then our third goal, SACOG supporting and learning from member and local partner agencies, is in incorporating racial equity best practices. So as I'd said, of our many stakeholders, we did reach out to city and county representatives, as well as our 2 RTPA partners. And this comes a lot out of that, and actually a lot out of some of the comments from the public members of the Race, Equity, Inclusion Working Group to provide support to member and local partner agencies. But we also saw that many cities and counties, all cities and counties are on the spectrum of doing racial equity work. Some are very far ahead of us, and so there's a lot that SACOG could learn from them. And some are just getting started or just, not even sure how to approach this. And so our goal is to really create a network and learning community of all of the member and partner agencies in the region. And the objectives really flow from that. And so you'll see in all of the objectives that we're really trying to collaborate and support. I want to call attention back to the board's racial equity statement of change and commitment, where we made commitments to support and serve our members. And so that's what we are attempting to do with the objectives and this goal. So that concludes the program focus area. And I would like to pause there to see if there are any questions or feedback on this.
At this point, I'd like to recognize Chair Kozlowski. Welcome back, Mike.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, and Wendy, if you're on a roll, please feel free to continue as chair for today.
Or I can finish this item and then turn it over to you if you'd like.
It's up to you.
Okay, I can finish this item.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, welcome. We're glad you're here. So at this point, do any committee members have any feedback on what they're excited about, what challenges you see, or what priorities you would have in this program section of this item? Any feedback for our staff? Director Frederick.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you so much. A couple of things. So one thing, I apologize. I wanted to raise for the last item and as well too, or the first sort of goals and operations. I do think that just you're asking for some feedback and such. I think so. First of all, on the operations side, I do think that goal number 2 for me personally is, I think, sort of, I would say, most important. I think that really, the internal sort of engaging and making sure that we have a workforce that reflects the diversity of the region, I think is really important to me. So that would just be my primary feedback on the operations side. On the program side, I do think that the item here, let's see, I'm just looking, sorry, I'm toggling back and forth. I think it's, sorry, my apologies. Hold on one sec. So goal number 2 here is sort of increasing funding for programs and projects that prioritize REI or specifically engage underrepresented and underserved communities in the SACOG region. I think that's actually really important as well in terms of ranking of priorities. So, there's definitely, I do think that there's going to be a natural sort of ability in the blueprint to sort of have, as is outlined here, to sort of update and sort of consider some of these issues, and that's important. But I also think, frankly, the investments are what's needed, overall, I think, to really help create some buy-in. I think it's going to, actually demand some investment. So that would be my sort of comments with regard to the sort of the program section. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Any other director comments on this item?
This is Stallard. I was thinking if we want to try to engage our Native American communities more, we now have at least 4 casinos in our 6-county area, maybe more. It might be nice to maybe have an event sometime and invite them. Also, I suspect they coordinate themselves at some level. It might be interesting to find out about that and to see if they might even jointly consider a representative. So, for some of these topics. That's my feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Are there any comments online, Robert?
There's no public comment.
All right. So at this point, I'll weigh in on this too. As far as programs, I think goal number 1 is critical, that as we walk through the blueprint process, obviously, that we get as many voices in that planning process as possible. I think that's really critical. And Director Ferricks, I have so appreciated your comments, and I agree with you. I do think it's very, though, important for SACOG as we walk through looking at our evaluation process to make sure that our rural regions, once again, I know I beat this drum a lot, though, are not kicked out of funding opportunities because they are not the same makeup as our more urban regions. Our rural regions have very different types of inequities. It's not always a racial lens, depending on where that rural region is. And I wouldn't want our programs evaluations and our funding criteria to be, so weighted with a one-size-fits-all model, that it is not applicable to our other SACOG regions that have different levels of disparities and inequities. So just a comment on that, although I agree with Director Frerichs, your comments as well. So, and that's a tricky balance to find. All right.
Thank you.
So with that, we're moving on to our last board practices.
Okay, Vice Chair Thomas and directors, this is James Corliss, and I will take this last one. For maybe I'm gonna add a reflection here in the middle of all of this to sort of remind us. Well, number one, I would say there's a remarkable amount of input that has, as you heard from Casey, that has already kind of gone into this plan, and truly remarkable amount of input, and I think that's beginning to reflect. You're seeing a lot of this as really, as Casey said, a response to that input. I'll also remind you that demographically, this region, the 6 counties, notwithstanding what you just said, Director Thomas, because we hear you, and that's partly why that goal, the first goal under the program area, reflects a lot of disparities by income and by urban and rural. But we have just passed a threshold in the 6 counties where we are now majority people of color per the last census, right? And that threshold to cross, I think, is a really important one. Any of you who were on the trip to Indianapolis by the Metro Chamber Study Mission back in 2019, I'm guessing, remembering, it was a really eye-opening one for many of us, because the business community in particular there was so articulate about racial equity and inclusion, and they understood it from a triple bottom line and economic competitiveness perspective. They had been losing out in terms of recruiting companies because they were not inclusive enough. As a region, they could be the most business-friendly region possible, but they were not doing the things that we've talked about, I think, and echoed in this draft racial equity action plan. And there was a session with some of their foundations and their nonprofits that was a smaller session that some of us attended that was just so eye-opening in terms of community engagement, engagement of Black and Indigenous and communities of color, and a lot of the things we're talking about here. So I don't know if people were on that trip, but it was an eye-opener, I think, for many of us. Okay, so back to the board practices. But I want to give you a little bit of the rationale and the reminder of why we and I think this is so important. So the last piece here, obviously, one that I have talked with many of you about, and it really just goes to continuing to really build the muscle of the board, to deepen the understanding of the board and all of us here on staff by understanding the dimensions of equity, of racial inequity, of disparities by race, ethnicity, income, and geography. And so doing that in a few ways. One is we obviously have, and we have done this to some extent, but really trying to be even more intentional about using our board workshops as a place to bring in speakers internal to the region, external to the region. We had a number of calls and requests, I think, interestingly, from different sectors and different places around the region to do something around the sort of the history, looking at the historical, the last couple of centuries in this region, how this region came to be, which I know can be challenging itself, right, in terms of looking at history through a race ethnicity lens, but a very important one nonetheless. And I think again, one which we've heard a lot of support for, because even myself as a relative newcomer, I'm still learning really kind of how this region came to be. And we've talked a lot at the board in the last 12, 18 months about things like redlining and a lot of 20th century practices, but there's much more I think we could do. The work of the Race Equity Inclusion Working Group is really important. I actually think that working group, much like the Commercial Corridors Task Force before it, being a mix of SACOG board members and external parties and stakeholders, has been fantastic. I think we've had a lot of really productive conversations, and a lot of this work, again, is reflected and obviously developed through that REI working group. So let's make sure we have a refresher, a primer lunch session. For new board members in particular, we will get some more new board members in January on the SACOG board, but also a refresher for those of you. So just kicking the year off and being intentional around making sure that we all remember and understand the work that's come through the Race Equity Inclusion Working Group, the statement, and now this action plan. And finally, a thought around, we do a lot of study missions. The Chamber does the study mission I referenced to Indianapolis. Obviously, we think it's very productive to take all of you as the SACOG board to different places, Salt Lake City most recently, San Diego and Denver before that. But perhaps what about an internal trip to actually better understand our region? What about doing something, maybe even with an offsite board meeting where we could get you all together and then do something somewhat low key, but hopefully informative and engaging around a community in our region that has been struggling with a lot of inequities and struggling to get a seat at the table and struggling to get investments. So those are some ideas, again, that have been raised through this first goal. So next slide. We've talked a lot about triple bottom line, equity, economy, environment. I thought we had an excellent board retreat to really, I think, deepen our collective understanding of that and its importance with a lot of our external partners. But how can we make sure we continue, if we are trying to get out into communities and have us all understand the challenges many communities face? What can we do to make sure that those perspectives are also brought to the board? So we have been working on a community voices committee, trying to actually be intentional and have a standing committee that reflects a lot of the different community perspectives around the region. So number one is the sort of the listen and learn theme, or the first sub goal of this, just really trying to make sure that we get those perspectives for you as the board, for us as an agency, in as many places as we can get them. And the other is having some sort of a standardized method to really assess the equity impacts of proposed policy decisions. And I will say this is in some ways easy to say and hard to do, but nonetheless really important. So simplifying this, there's in some ways, there's two ways to think about equity impacts. One is around an engagement process. So, and believe me, as we've said many times, all of your grants and your transportation grants you'll be developing, especially for federal funding, increasingly for state funding, are going to ask this very question. Right, what are the equity benefits, the racial equity benefits, the community benefits of your transportation project that you want to win funding for? And you typically, the first half of that question is around engagement, and more than just holding a sort of a public meeting late at night. It's really around being creative in terms of community engagement and being intentional. And the second, I would say, generally speaking, is really around understanding the data in terms of benefits. Historically, that data has really been tied to place and location. So in other words, is your infrastructure investment physically located in a low-income community of color? That's tricky when it comes to transportation, because just because a project is in a community that's either low income or a community of color does not mean that community benefits from it, right? There's a really interesting, it's not exactly a sort of a one-for-one relationship. There may be a project outside that community the community benefits from. There may be a project in that community that was not requested necessarily by that community. It may have negative impacts on it, right? So this is the trick of transportation: it is not just all local. But again, I think trying to figure out how we could give you all as the decision makers a little bit more of a standardized routine method of getting some analysis on those equity, benefits and the sort of the flip side of that, the impacts would be important. So next slide, next goal. And then again, maybe easy to say and a little harder to follow through on, but we're making sure that we don't adopt a racial equity action plan and, like every other plan, have that sit on the shelf, right? So how does the board continue its engagement? What's the role of the Race Equity Inclusion Working Group going forward? Again, I think we would say that I think this has been a very productive and constructive and fruitful working group with the mix of board members and external stakeholders. Perhaps the REI working group going forward should be overseeing the implementation. Maybe the makeup looks different because perhaps it includes some of those agencies and community stakeholders who are part of this, who are part of actually making it work and making it successful. How do we incorporate progress reports to you? I'm flipping the goals here, but to read the slide B3A. But how do we give you progress reports that aren't just on your calendar every month because we said they'd be on your calendar every month, but are actually substantive and meaningful and insightful? How do you want to get progress reports on the implementation of the Racial Equity Action Plan? So I think that's it. Is there one more slide, Robert? All right. So that's the board practices piece. And again, since this is really in large part about all of you and your role as board members and committee meetings and board meetings, we'd love to get your feedback.
Well, James, I really appreciate that in-depth background to kind of help set the framework for what this work is all about. That was very, very helpful. And personally, I love the idea of all of us deepening our understanding of our local communities and what the issues are before us. I think that will be very important going forward as we look at this work. So I personally love that idea. Do any directors have any further comments on this item as far as our board work? Not seeing any. All right. Robert, are there any online comments?
There are no public comments.
All right. Well, Casey and James, I think this was just, very helpful in getting a deeper understanding of where we are with this work and where we're going with it. And just, thank you very much for this update. And I think it was just very helpful at this point to understand the opportunities before us. So at this point, Mike, information item number 5 is done. I will turn it over to you, Chair Kozlowski, to take us from here.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Thomas. Okay, well, I guess then I will ask if you'll please call the next item, Mr. Clerk.
All right, we are on to item 6, 2024 Blueprint Early Outreach Efforts, presented by AJ Tendick, SACOG staff.
Good morning, board members. I wanted to share an update to our Blueprint Outreach Plan. This is totally consistent with updates you have gotten prior. This is just more of a fine-tuning as we get deeper into the process. Now we have just more information and we wanted to keep you up to date. First and foremost, I wanted to talk about what we're doing with community-based organizations. We have a draft request for qualifications that we're working through a process internally with staff and with the attorneys to get posted. We really want to deepen our relationships with community-based organizations across the region. And this is consistent with, say, the way that we did Blueprint outreach 20 years ago, and on and off over the last 20 years. But what we'd like to do now is really approach it in a way that we are not only making relationships for this particular plan update, but really for the agency and to institutionalize a lot of those relationships where we have kind of structures and agreements in place that we keep that relationship going. It's not a one-off that we talk to them once every 4 years or so. Much in line with the conversation from the prior item with our tribal governments as well. That will be another separate effort as part of this plan update that we kind of reach out to those groups and try to not just treat that as a kind of once every 4 years effort, but really try to engage with them. With the CBO specifically, we wanted to so we're doing a couple of things. One is we have that request for qualifications to really get those relationships. And what we would like to do is then work with the CBOs to outreach directly to their membership, do some education, share our survey that we'll be releasing this fall. And we will also work to release that survey through our normal channels. But we understand that those are the folks that we normally talk to. And so we want to really make sure that we are more diverse than that. So we anticipate that going out this fall. And then also working with those community-based organizations, we're standing up a committee, an advisory committee called the Community Voices Committee, which the board has approved, that will also work to institutionalize some of those relationships where we really, as staff at SACOG, are bringing items through that committee on a regular basis, sort of like early in the planning process, and then allow them to work back through their communities and then bring us feedback as appropriate or on the fly, depending on what the items are. So just another way that we're really working through sort of at a big picture to institutionalize that. But what we want to do then is work directly with the blueprint items, as I mentioned, the survey. But then also as we get deeper into whether it's pathways or values or big picture policy issues that we're working through, like pricing or housing affordability, that we really are kind of deepening our input into the plan. Another effort that we are undergoing here shortly is we're working directly with Valley Vision. They have a series of polling efforts that they are working with Sac State on. We are partnering with them on their built environment polling, which will happen also this fall. So that's a scientific level polling that they'll lead. And I we believe we will have results late fall, early winter to share back with that. And then similar timing, a little bit later, we'll start doing some focus groups. And then what those are a lot more informal. We spend a little more time with groups, and we're going to be diving into some of our stickier, bigger picture issues such as pricing and how we're going to pay for the system. And again, housing affordability, because that is such a big issue across our region, and how we address that in the plan. And then we have 2 rounds of elected outreach that we're working on this year. We have our state required ones that we do much later in the process, for those of you who have been through that process. That is where we go around the region and we hold eight of these elected official meetings. And we have received fairly some feedback that, that's so late in the process that they're not really all that helpful for the elected officials that are attending to really provide meaningful input into the plan. So we are in process. I know we visited Woodland not too long ago, Folsom as well, really making the rounds to visit all of you on your home turf, to visit your colleagues, to allow you to and your colleagues to give us direct input on your priorities. And so we're sort of bookending this, where it's a little bit early in the process now, where there's not the nuanced level of detail of which project is in, whether it's a housing project or a road, but really sort of opening that relationship up with the region's electeds. And then finally, the thing that you all will be familiar with if you've been here for 4 years with us is our outreach that we'll be doing next year. And this is some of our required outreach that will look very similar to what we've done in the last cycle, and that we hold pop-ups, and we will come to your community events across the region and host a table. And we treat that a little bit differently than just say like a table with a bunch of brochures out. We really, in the last round, I think we had like potted plants and a decorative background, and like it didn't really feel like a government booth. And we had like, activities for kids and that kind of stuff, so that one staff member would be doing a temporary tattoo and some kids games, so that mom or dad can, take a couple minutes with us, get some brief introduction, take our survey. So that will be the sort of the later round of our more hands-on public outreach. So this engagement strategy went to the REI working group a couple weeks ago. We incorporated some feedback, some stuff that we were going to be doing anyway, but didn't document well. So a lot of that was working with the the community-based organizations earlier to help them or have them kind of give us input on these materials and stuff that we're going to be providing them to really reach their members in a better way than we would necessarily do on our own. Also translate into as many languages as feasible, that sort of feedback. So with that, I want to leave some time if you all had feedback on this approach or wanted to know more about any one of those items.
So directors, any questions or comments for AJ?
Looks like Director Stollard has his hand raised.
Tom, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, AJ. Appreciate all of the good work that's being done. I want to reflect back again to our original blueprint. I'm glad we've renamed this because I think that's much more accessible for folks than an acronym. But I know one of the things I think made the original blueprint so successful was it became a collaborative, the outreach became collaborative. SACOG didn't own the whole outreach activity. In fact, they did grant some funding to Valley Vision, which you mentioned, to Breathe California, which at the time was very engaged with the process and got out a lot of people, Metro Chamber. And as we talk about diversity and inclusion, I think, well, you know, we ought to be looking out and seeing other groups actually have a role and take some ownership. We actually had a little steering committee. It wasn't ever more than about 5 or 6 people, but we would actually talk about the progress of the blueprint through the process, and also try to structure turnout so that we had a lot of diversity at our turnout, not just in the ethnic sense, but also in the occupational and orientation and political point of view. So I wonder if going ahead, we should not think about perhaps trying to do more of that. So this isn't just SACOG's deal for everybody else, but it becomes a community deal for ourselves. When we were in Salt Lake City, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me was the fact that Envision Utah, the sponsoring group of the blueprint, never went away. Whereas we just all went back to our corners. I recall the collaboration of our civic institutions, such as I just quoted, was at a high water mark during the blueprint process because we were all working together for a common objective. But I haven't felt that way in years. You know, the Metro Chamber's doing their thing, we're doing ours, Valley Vision. I mean, I don't feel the strong collaborative ties. So I'm just offering that as something to think about, because not only for the benefit of this iteration of what I'll call the blueprint, but also the fact that it's an ongoing activity. Envision Utah continues to do scenario exercises with people in the community. We don't typically do that except for this quadrennial task. Thank you.
Good, thoughtful comments. Thank you, Director Stollard. Other members of the panel?
Yes, I do have a quick question. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
So on page 2, AJ, it talks about that SACOG is putting together a bench of community consultants to bring in community expertise, perspectives, and programs. And it talks about those being the community-based organizations, nonprofits, faith communities, whatever we have. What does that process look like? What does that mean that we're bringing in community consultants to bring in all of those, to identify those entities in each community? How are we doing that across the SACOG region?
Sorry, to clarify, is the question, how are we identifying the groups, or what is the process in establishing the relationships?
I guess, good question. How is SACOG bringing in a bench of community consultants? Are we having community consultants in each of the SACOG regions to then further identify who needs to be included in this process within that county or city? Recognizing that we have a very diverse region. So how are we establishing that?
Yeah, it's a tricky task to be able to both geographically and demographically be representative in our region. And so we've built a process that is open-ended in this case. And so like this request for qualifications that I had mentioned is really just a means to, we can't, as a government agency and often with federal funds in particular, like it's very particular on the documentation involved in that, and it's onerous. And so we need to go through a little bit of formality to establish some of these relationships with folks. But wanted to do so, I don't think it'll be on a rolling basis, but I think we'll maybe like open the call quarterly or every 6 months or something like that. So that it allows us to sort of, create a small network and then expand it. And then, so who do you know? Who should we be talking to? Expand it again. And, the baseline there will be working through both our members and partners. So, EDCTC, the county and Placerville up in your way, we expect that they'll have a relationship that we might not have. And so we'll ask for some introductions and what are their thoughts. And then, work to expand that and then sort of reassess regularly.
Okay, great. Thank you. Recognizing that's a huge task because we are a very large, diverse region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Thomas. Wendy, Krista, anything else? Lucas? Okay, well, I will add a couple of comments. I had the pleasure of having a presentation from James at our city council meeting in Folsom last week that kind of got the ball rolling a little bit. And it's such early days that it was, 30,000 foot view of the process. But, in listening to Director Thomas and Director Stollard and having seen that presentation, I think it's never too early potentially to kind of put some more first simple context around what the exercise is of developing the blueprint, which if you like dumb it down to its very simplest form that anybody can understand, it is kind of like the game Sims or Zoo Tycoon, if you guys remember that one, or City Tycoon, where you are trying to optimize results, right? Based on tinkering with the infrastructure that we have, right? And, where it is that we choose to put our funding. So I think that might be one way to kind of soften the understanding for people of what it is that we're after. And then with that as a kind of a intellectual starting point, make sure that we are careful to describe the factors that we must optimize for against the ones that we choose to optimize for, so that people understand what their choices are, or so the board members at least understand what the choices are in the scenario building, right? So I think that's, there are some factors that we just simply have to optimize for, but there are others where we get to make some choices, right? And then finally, ultimately, we are, using a really, really, really well-educated crystal ball to try and create outcomes that are beneficial to everybody, but making sure to remain sort of open about the variation that's still possible within those outcomes, so that people don't think that it is a planning straitjacket that dictates every single aspect of people's lives and planning activities, because ultimately we still have a great deal, as much as the state of California keeps chipping away at it, we still have some reasonable autonomy for local planning. And we don't want to, make people think that we are completely overriding that. So take that for what it's worth. But I think that is some ways to kind of talk about this that might be helpful to at least, the 50-something-year-old demographic I'm part of. So.
Thank you. Chair Kozlowski, this is James. I appreciate that since we were just out there, and I was just saying to our staff earlier this morning, in some ways we're nice and early giving you all a heads up that this big plan is coming. In other ways, we're searching for ways to sort of make it a bit more real, right? And to talk about some of those optimization factors you're saying. And I think AJ mentioned this. We're also going to be doing a lot of really interesting polling, focus groups. We're going to be partnering with organizations like Valley Vision to actually get some really good feedback, I think, updated feedback through a variety of those forms. Of course, this committee will be privy to that because that's part of your charge. The other, when you talk about something like a plan that goes out to 2050, that encompasses all of the things it encompasses, right? It is hard for people to wrap their heads around. And I appreciate your Sims analogy. The other one I would throw out there for you all to turn over is, and maybe some of you actually know what I'm talking about through actual experience. We have a big house project. We're about to do a big renovation and we're going to expand our house, except that our roof is actually leaking and it looks like we've just discovered we've got to rebuild the foundation and we have a very limited budget to do it. So how are we going to do that? In some ways, I do think that's how we see the challenge of the blueprint, the challenge of the plan, and not to think in terms of total fiscal constraint and minimizing resources, but it is really maximizing creative problem solving, right? And maximizing those outcomes. So I'm open to any and all, we are open to any and all ideas about how best to do this, both in the next cycle of getting to all the boards and city councils, but also as we get into next year with the blueprint.
Thank you, James. Tom?
Yes. I don't know. I've never paid attention to how the whole blueprint is funded. Perhaps you could give us a little primer on that. And I'd like, the reason I'm asking that is when we did the blueprint, the initial blueprint, we gave small grants to some of these other parties, not to Metro Chamber, but certainly to Valley Vision, a substantial one to them. And we ought to ask ourselves, how do we get the most utility out of these dollars? Should we do it ourselves, or should we export a little of these tasks in order for more sense of ownership and buy-in from others? So could you give us a little primer on how we fund the whole blueprint? Thank you.
I can't do the primer on the full funding, but to answer the sort of specific question there is, we really are in some ways replicating what we did 20 years ago. Instead of working with Valley Vision as sort of a wholesaler for a lot of those funds, though, in the CBO relationships, we're really doing it directly with those community-based organizations. And so we have dedicated funding to offer grants, and we're sort of working through that process now of what that looks like. We're trying to do it, again, to simplify that as much as possible into maybe looking like a fixed cost menu of options in terms of both their reach and the opportunity, like the types of outreach that they wanted to do. So say like for $500, you get for sending an email, or like $1,000 would be like, oh, you have a larger group and you're getting more survey responses. So working directly with that to provide them funding, because we know that those groups are not set up to serve the government. They're set up to serve their members and their communities. So we want to try to make that easy to tap into those populations, because we're, as a regional organization, we're just not going to have those deep local relationships in that same way. So that's what we're really looking to provide the funding to do that.
I could take it a step further. I'm not presuming any necessary wisdom on this, but it still seems like what you just said means we keep the control. And what I'm saying is, if you really want collaborative behavior and buy-in, you have to share a little of the control. And so I would respectfully suggest we think about that. Now, Valley Vision was phenomenal at the original one, and it evolved as an organization. It has a much wider range of tasks now than it did then. So whether it's the right one or not, but I do feel we need to be thinking about sharing control if we want to inspire collaborative behavior and more engagement. And I don't know, I think that's one of the things we ought to be talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, well noted. Thank you.
Here, Tom. Okay, any final comments on this topic? All right, outstanding. Let's close this one and move on to item number 7, please. Thank you, AJ.
We're on to item 7. That's the advocacy update presented by Sabrina Bradbury, SACOG staff.
Good morning, committee members. A very brief state advocacy update for you. The legislature is continuing to push bills through August 31st to try and get those to the governor for signature. And then the governor will have until the end of September to sign anything that goes to his desk. I want to save most of the time for our federal advocacy update, and I'll turn it over to our federal lobbyists in a minute. But I would note on attachment B, we have the bills on which we took support positions, and 3 out of the 4 that are green have now been enrolled and will go to the governor for signature. SCA 2 has not moved that far. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Devin Barnhart and Jason Pavlicek for a federal advocacy update.
Sorry, just getting my share screen going. Hi, everyone. It's Devin. It's been a while since we've seen you, but we're back with the federal update. It's, as always, Jason and I, who are SACOG's team in DC. There have been a ton of happenings in Washington, DC that have gone all the way to the president signing bills into law, which is, not our normal in DC. We like to spend a lot of time fighting about things, but really a rush of activity here at the end of the year leading into their summer break. And so this chart is a little misleading. It's not really this overlap, but I just want to give you a sense of sort of very big picture funding bills that are happening for what might start happening in the region as this new money starts flowing out the door. The one you all know about, we've spent a lot of time talking about, is that one at the top. That's the bipartisan infrastructure law, where all the transportation funding and other sorts of infrastructure funding are coming from. We're starting to see those grants roll out the door. And then the 2 new ones are on the bottom. There's $280 billion in CHIPS plus science. It's really a fascinating title they've come up with, but it's essentially bringing domestic manufacturing back, and with a real focus on innovation, and then also a huge science component in that bill. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure folks have heard a lot about, which again has a curious title, but is really one of the largest climate bills we have ever funded. So there's a lot of excitement around these bills, and these 3, for a long time, a year or 2 ago, you heard us talk a lot about reconciliation and Build Back Better. These 3 sort of combine to form the vast majority of the president's initial domestic agenda that he proposed. And so big, gigantic wins in terms of getting that domestic agenda passed into law. But what it means for us is twofold. One, there's a big focus on climate funding in all of these bills, big focus on innovation, and a lot of focus on regional funding in general. And then the other big picture takeaway is that most of these 2 new bills aren't inherently transportation, aren't inherently a sort of our specific work, but will and could have a big impact on the types of projects that we see in the region, any of the new work that the communities are talking about largely. So just want to make sure they're on your radar. So I'm just going to give you the very big highlights of these bills. The CHIPS Plus Science Act, lots of people just call it CHIPS, is really about increasing our competitiveness, particularly against China. Huge focus on STEM workforce, growing that workforce. Some solutions in this bill around the climate crisis, particularly in the energy sector, a lot of science and innovation money, and then the main chunk is really around this domestic manufacturing, and particularly around making sure that we have chips that are being produced in the United States and we're not wholly reliant on other countries in our supply chain. This has in the transportation space, this has a big impact on the ability to produce electric vehicles and other kinds of vehicles, including could have very serious impacts on transit buses that are being converted or that are being created for electric fleets. There are a couple of programs in here just to flag that focus a little bit more in our space in terms of the region. There's a pilot program through EDA that looks at economic development for distressed communities. There's $2 billion in funding to boost manufacturing at the state and local level, and then another $10 billion for these regional technical hubs. People are very excited about these regional technical hubs. We're at a slight disadvantage because they are regional hubs intended to increase what we already have going in Silicon Valley. Just our geographical closeness to that is not super helpful. But as we think about our own regional hub in the Sacramento area, this is a spot where folks are looking to really bring new innovation to new places. The Inflation Reduction Act, this is just a massive, gigantic bill. I will not go into the vast majority of it. I'm just going to flag a couple of things in the climate space, but just for your awareness, this bill has three major components. One is really around budget and fighting inflation, a lot around domestic energy production, and then the big host chunk of the bill that everyone is really excited about and spending a lot of time talking about in the press is really this big climate focus of the bill. There are a couple spaces we're really excited for in here that we spend time working on to make sure we're included. $3 billion for neighborhood access and equity fund. This is a broad-based program that transportation is eligible for, looking at things like reconnecting communities that have been divided by infrastructure, safety projects. It has a pretty broad scope of eligible activities. We're not yet clear how this is going to get baked into all the other transportation money flowing out the door. So that's TBD, but exciting that they're doing this real big focus for additional transportation money for neighborhoods. And then a lot of funding in this bill. There was also a lot of funding in bipartisan infrastructure law, but a continued push for zero emission vehicles. This is across the board. Some of it's electric, some of it's hydrogen. There's a host of different modes that are moving forward. This one was particularly focused on heavy duty. The bipartisan infrastructure law had a lot of funding for transit buses in particular. So that'll round out sort of the full scope of funding that gets available for those two worlds. And then last but not least, there's $3 billion for environmental and climate justice block grants. This is another one where a lot of the things that we've identified in Green Means Go or any of our other climate focused activities could see some benefits. It's not exactly clear how those funds will work yet, but it's a big pot of funding that we're watching. Then I just want to give you a quick update on bipartisan infrastructure law. That package has been moving forward. We've been seeing grants roll out the door. Quick flag on the RAISE grants. This is just to give you a sense. There were 166 projects that got funded. 2/3 of them were in disadvantaged communities. About 1/3 of them are multimodal. So they're looking across the board at how our projects intersect. And the other 2/3 are really in the highway transit planning space. We were obviously very excited to have the $5 million for SACOG in planning grants that is going to be, it's very aligned with what the department is looking at in terms of priorities. And so I think it's going to be a great grant project to inform lots of things that the department is looking at. So I think it'll have a broader reach beyond just our region, which it'll be great for, but I think it's going to be something the department looks to as well. So really excited to start getting that project implemented. Couple of other things to flag. More grants are coming down the pipeline. The SMART grants are the next big one out the door. This is $100 million per year over the next 5 years, focused on safety and ITS deployment projects. So these are great projects for communities. Sorry if you can hear my son screaming in the background, he just woke up. These are great projects for if you want to test out as a community or as a region, you want to test out technology. This is a year's worth of funding, and then next year you can apply for a year's worth of implementation. But these are great for those folks that are looking to implement new intelligent transportation systems and need planning and partners to all come together at the table with funding. That's what these grants are focused on. One other thing that we're watching in Washington, D.C. is the appropriations bill. This is our standard funding for transportation. It's where we get a lot of our transit funding and passenger rail funding. And that bill is in the works and hopefully going to be passed by the end of the year. We'll give you an update on that closer to the end of the year, but that's a big picture thing we're watching. And one last thing to flag, it doesn't directly impact us, but you may start seeing a lot of press about it, which is that there is a national rail labor negotiation going on the freight railroad sides between labor and management. Those conversations have not been going well. They have gone through a process where the president puts together a board that makes recommendations, but you might start hearing a lot about it, particularly at September. The recommendations came out, but in September, that's when the unions decide whether or not they strike. Could impact any of the railroads, depending on if any of the particular unions strike. And so there may be a lot of press on it, but it's a little bit up in the air right now what's going to happen and what the larger impact will be. But as that comes to fruition, and we should have a sense over the next 2 weeks, we'll keep everyone informed. But it's one of the larger issues that folks will be talking about as that September 16th deadline comes up for those labor negotiations. And that's everything. Any questions about any of that? I know I just threw a lot of dollar signs at you, but a lot of money coming out of Washington, D.C. right now. Happy to answer any questions on it or to share more details if there are particular issues you all are interested in.
How is a massive amount of spending going to help with inflation? I'm sorry, never mind. Get that one.
I kindly defer to whoever.
Directors, any questions? Directors, any questions on the update here? Thank you all, Jason and Devin. Great to hear from you guys.
Likewise, good to see you all.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's mostly good news coming out of Washington in terms of the project work that is in the wheelhouse of SACOG and our planning agencies. I guess we'll get more news as the year goes on, and we'll see how the funding gets distributed in fine detail here over the next 18 months or 2 years. Well, if there's no other, yes.
Just wanted to round out that update with also mentioning that we are continuing to partner with EDCTC and PCTPA to do ongoing communications about all of these federal grants that are coming out. So we are letting all of our members and partners know that we're here to provide technical assistance and letters of support, and also matchmaking, to the extent that we see an opportunity for jurisdictions to submit a bigger, broader application jointly. We want to make sure that we're letting folks know what all the different ideas out there are. So just wanted to flag that we're continuing to get the word out about those grants and thinking about how we support all of our members and partners in application process.
A cheat sheet of programs for the entirety of the SACOG board might be useful.
Great, we'll get something out to you.
Okay, fantastic. All right, very good. Well, that's if there's no other comment on that, thank you, Sabrina. Appreciate that, and everybody else. Our last item is a receive and file, so I will accept that and ask the staff to please file it appropriately. And any last words from the executive director for the good of the order?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Kozlowski. Just to round out that last item, and I think we do have a pretty good cheat sheet that we're now we're sort of pushing out. I'm sure we could share that with the board of all the grant programs. We continue, I think, to try to get our arms around how we as a 6-county region are going to coordinate properly, effectively coordinate all of our grant applications, right? With more grant programs than ever before, especially federally. And staff's doing a great job just trying to be really proactive and ears to the ground. But we do ask everybody, all of our partner agencies, right, to give us the heads up, at least so we know what's actually going in. And we can help shape those. We're also asking for support letters now 14 days in advance. So we just have a bit of an early take on those. But again, as we continue to go forward, this committee, I want to challenge all of you to help us think about how as a region, we can be coordinated in all of our asks. We're not just scattershot into the feds asking for everything from all the programs. Just two other items of note, as Casey told you earlier on the Racial Equity Action Plan, that will go to the REI Working Group at the end of September, and it will come back to you at your October committee meeting for an adoption action. Also, this afternoon, those of you on the Strategic Planning Committee, which is all the former SACOG board chairs and the current board leadership, will have a draft strategic plan document that you'll be taking up and providing feedback on. We'll give that to the whole board at your September board meeting, but we are looking also for an adoption on that. So in October. So October next month, believe it or not, that is more or less next month is going to be a big month in terms of taking up these things for adoption. So you'll have those on your agenda in October.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. Directors, any final thoughts or good news? All right, Vice Chair Thomas, thank you for pinch hitting on short notice.
My pleasure.
And Robert for being flexible with my weird schedule this morning. Thanks everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our either this afternoon or at the main board meeting later this month.
Sounds good. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Have a good afternoon.